You were told the world was broken. Crumbling ecosystems, rising waters, economic collapse. But hope was packaged and delivered in a sleek presentation, a grand plan with a simple promise. 17 goals to save humanity, end poverty, clean energy, global peace. Who could argue with that? But beneath those noble words lies a different architecture. You see, this story didn't begin today. It began decades ago, in boardrooms you weren't invited to, with decisions you never voted on. This isn't conspiracy, this is business, the business of remaking society. But the brilliance of this system isn't that it forces you to comply, it's that it makes you want to. Therefore, you don't just accept it, you celebrate it. Walk with me through a modern city. Notice the cameras at every corner, scanning not just for criminals but for patterns. Your phone tracks every step, every purchase, every message. But you're not concerned. Because it's convenient. Because it keeps you safe. Therefore, you've been trained to see surveillance as a service. This isn't just happening in China or some distant authoritarian regime. It's happening in New York, in London, in Sydney. But the system's greatest achievement isn't technological, it's psychological. You've been taught that privacy is selfish, that anonymity is suspicious. Therefore, you willingly surrender what previous generations would have died to protect. The system operates on 3 principles: identity, currency, and access. First, identity. Not just who you are, but what you do, what you believe, you say. Your digital self becomes more important than your physical self, more permanent, more scrutinized. But that digital self isn't truly yours. It's a product to be rated, ranked, and restricted. Therefore, your freedoms no longer depend on laws, but on algorithms. Second, currency, not just money, but the very concept of value. When money becomes code, it can be programmed, limited, tracked. Cash offers anonymity. Digital currency offers convenience, with a catch. Therefore, your ability to participate in society becomes conditional. And finally, access to travel, to work, to healthcare. When everything requires digital permission, freedom becomes theoretical. But the system doesn't present itself as control, it presents itself as care. Therefore, resistance feels not just difficult, but wrong. Stanley Milgram's famous experiment proved something chilling about human nature. When an authority figure in a lab coat told subjects to administer electric shocks to strangers, 65% went all the way to the highest potentially lethal voltage. No force was used, just the power of perceived authority. But today's authorities don't wear lab coats. They wear designer suits and give TED Talks. Therefore, when they tell you that compliance is compassion, you believe them. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment revealed another truth. Ordinary people quickly adapt to their assigned roles in a system. Guards became cruel, prisoners became submissive within days. But our modern system doesn't need prison guards. It has notifications, updates, terms of service. Therefore, your behavior is shaped not by force, but by friction. The path of least resistance becomes the only path you consider. This system wasn't built overnight. It was introduced in phases. First as optional, then as preferred, finally as required. But each step was presented as progress, as innovation, as inevitability. Therefore, questioning the direction became equivalent to opposing the future itself. Language evolved to serve the system. Safety replaced control. Misinformation replaced dissent. Privacy became having something to hide. Independence became non-compliance. But the most effective tactic was making resistance inconvenient. Therefore, most people stopped resisting not because they agreed, but because it was exhausting not to. Systems of control always reach a breaking point, not because they fail, but because they succeed too well. When every aspect of life requires permission, something primal awakens in the human spirit. But this awakening doesn't happen all at once. It happens person by person, choice by choice. Therefore, change begins not with revolution, but with recognition. you begin to see the cage you've helped build around yourself. The endless terms and conditions you've agreed to without reading. The gradual surrender of your attention, your data, your autonomy. But awareness alone isn't enough. It must lead to action. Therefore, the path to freedom begins with simple choices that feel radical in a digital age. True resistance isn't loud, it's consistent. It begins with protecting what matters most: your mind. Creating space to think without algorithm-driven influence. But a free mind needs community to thrive. Therefore, you seek others who remember what it means to live without constant permission. You rediscover old skills: growing food, fixing things, teaching children. You use cash when possible, meet in person rather than online, speak directly rather than through platforms. But this path isn't easy. The system labels you as backward, paranoid, problematic. Therefore, the greatest challenge isn't external pressure, but internal doubt. You question whether independence is worth the cost. Whether you're overreacting to what everyone else sees as progress. But then you experience something that digital life cannot provide: genuine connection. Moments that aren't optimized, monetized, or measured. Therefore, what began as resistance becomes something else: remembrance. The system's greatest vulnerability is its complexity. It requires constant energy, constant maintenance, constant compliance. But human connection requires none of these. Therefore, the alternative isn't built on fighting the system, but on making it irrelevant. This isn't about returning to the past. It's about creating a human-scale future, where technology serves people, not systems. Where value isn't determined by algorithms, but by contribution. Where identity isn't a profile to be ranked, but a life to be lived. But this alternative must be built deliberately, with clear boundaries. Therefore, you create spaces where digital systems cannot follow. You practice the forgotten art of discretion, of privacy, of silence. Not out of paranoia, but out of wisdom. The system wasn't built in a day, and it won't be unmade in a day. But every day offers choices that bend your path toward freedom or dependence. Will you accept every update without question? Every new requirement without resistance? Or will you pause, consider, decide based on values rather than convenience? But the most important question isn't what you'll do, it's who you'll become. Will you be a node in a network, a data point in a system? Or will you be fully human, flawed but free? Therefore, your real power isn't in fighting the system, but in remembering what it means to live beyond it. To think slowly in an age of instant reactions. To build deeply in an age of shallow connections. To live with purpose in an age of endless distraction. The year is 2025. The plan for 2030 accelerates daily. Digital IDs are expanding. Cash is disappearing. Physical spaces are requiring digital permissions. But simultaneously, an ancient memory is awakening. People gathering face to face, skills being shared hand to hand, stories being told heart to heart. Therefore, two futures emerge side by side. One efficient but controlled, one messy but free. The choice between them won't be made once but daily. Not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent actions. But here's what the system doesn't want you to know. You are not alone. Millions are quietly choosing a different path. Not because they fear technology, but because they value humanity more. Therefore, the future isn't determined by those with the most power, but by those with the clearest vision. And that vision begins with a simple truth: you were born free. No system, no matter how advanced, can override that birthright, unless you let it. So as you walk away from this message, ask yourself one question: will you live by permission or by principle? The choice, as always, remains yours. But remember, when enough people make the same choice, it ceases to be a choice and becomes a movement. Therefore, your smallest act of independence ripples far beyond what you can see. Your courage inspires others. Your boundaries protect more than yourself. You are not just choosing your future, you're preserving possibility for generations to come. This is not about fear, it's about remembrance. Remembering what it means to be sovereign, to be dignified, to be free. Before remembering itself becomes classified as misinformation. The time to choose is now, while choice still exists. What will you choose?